When I found out that the book had another year to be published, my response to Krister was, no, it needs to come out now. We can't wait another year.
Krister Ungerböck is a communication expert. He's an executive coach, he's an author, and he's a former tech CEO. Prior to retiring at age 42, Krister was the award-winning CEO of one of the largest family-owned software companies in the world. Krister's unique perspective into communication is based on his experience leading teams in 3 languages. He's worked with leaders in more than 40 countries and built businesses on 5 different continents. Krister's insights on emotional intelligence, leadership, and also employee engagement are often featured in nationwide media outlets such as Forbes Inc. and NPR. He was awarded the St. Louis Business Journal 40 Under 40. Krister's upcoming book is tentatively titled 22 Talk Shifts and subtitled Little Language Changes That Make a Big Difference. It'll be published in 2020. Please join me in welcoming Krister Ungerböck.
My most profound insights did not come while I was CEO of one of the largest family-owned software companies in the world. They came at the YMCA while I was signing up for a gym membership. A young woman is typing my responses to the gym membership application into her computer when she asked me the question that changed my life. Who is your emergency contact? And I broke down crying. In this moment, I had no one. And I look back on my life. Here I was a CEO of a global company with hundreds of employees in 8 countries. I started reading leadership books when I was 12 years old because I wanted to be a great leader. And here I was signing up for a gym membership, and not even my own family chose to follow me. And I thought, where did I go wrong? What did I miss? I had all these hard skills. I went to the right schools. I went to Indiana, studied business, and I had been reading probably, thousands of business books by that time over the course of my life. And I had all these hard skills about goal setting and leadership, but I had not really paid any attention to the soft skills. And so I set aside all that business education and business books, and I poured myself into the soft side. I found myself in some interesting settings. I heard the word universe and a lot of new age conversations over the course of those years, but I always kept my CEO hat on because like many of you, I was an engineer. And I wanted practical tools, not kind of psychobabble and things like that. So I was going into these rooms with the intention of, how can I walk away with tools that are practical and concrete and hard implementations of these soft skills that clearly I had spent my entire life missing. And I use this, what I call talk shifts, to change my own emotional intelligence and soft skills. And what I find is what I call these little language changes that make a big difference both in business and in life. And early on in that journey, as I was adventuring into soft skills, I came across the research by a man named Dr. John Gottman. And Dr. John Gottman is known as probably the world's preeminent researcher on marriage and divorce. And he's known for being able to predict with 94% accuracy whether a couple will get divorced after watching a couple of hours of video of them arguing or having a tense conversation. And what he looks for is 4 specific communication patterns. Now, what struck me is that when I learned about these 4 communication patterns, is that those 4 communication patterns were present in every single broken relationship that I had in business as well. My relationship with my father, senior executives who I'd fired, salespeople who left and took ideas and customers to the competition. In all cases, every major relationship, these same 4 predictors were present. And so it encouraged me to think of, how can I take some of these ideas out of the kind of soft skills and relationship world and try to apply them to business? And at the same time, take the things that I did learn, the hard skills in business, and apply them to help us be better parents and spouses along the way. One of the simple talk shifts, the first one, was something that Dr. Gottman said, and much of his research is, simply eliminate the phrases, you always and you never. You can imagine, like, you always show up late, you never do the dishes. But at the same time, these kind of phrases also happen at work. How often do you find yourself saying to a colleague or a leader saying to you, you always show up late for the meetings, or your projects are never on time, or whatever. So taking these simple talk shifts and saying, eliminate these simple words from our vocabulary and look for some substitutes. I'll give you some of those substitutes as we go through. Today I'm going to take you through 10 specific talk shifts. And I have, as we go through, I've been to a lot of these conferences, and we walk away with pages of notes, and then we put our notes in the drawer, and we don't do anything. So if you take out your mobile phone, what you can do is you can track your action items. You can put them into this little website, and later you can put your email address, and you can select, I'll send you a reminder in a week or 2 weeks. I'm not going to spam you or anything, but you can use that. And also, as you go through that, you can also choose an accountability partner. Some of these talk shifts are more difficult than others, and it may be helpful to have someone who's going to be an accountability partner who you step into these talk shifts with. As we go through the talk shifts, I'd like you to keep 2 people in mind. The first person, think of someone at work. Usually the talk shifts, you'll learn most if you choose someone who kind of frustrates you. I found that getting through these relationships at work and at home that frustrate us are the ones where we learn the most. But the second, I'd also like you to take someone from your personal life as your second person. And again, maybe choose someone who frustrates you. And think about, as we go through these talk shifts, to what extent do these talk shifts show up in your communication with that person? And the more we can change our communication patterns with that person, the more likely we can have a more productive relationship. So the person for me who I would have chosen if I was in the audience was my father. And a little bit of background about me and my relationship with my father, because it's relevant to our talk today. I started programming at age 12. My father started a business when I was 10 years old, a technology business. And his dream was that I would grow up and take over the business when he retired someday. And so I started learning programming in an archaic programming language called RPG. Most of you probably have never even heard of this language. But if you're looking for a good punishment for a teenager, it's spelled RPG. So it's very cryptic. And so I would go into the office when other kids were out playing baseball. I would get woken up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would go to learn RPG. And when I was 17 years old, before I came to Indiana University, my father gave me a project to design the technical architecture for the next generation of our software. And there was one challenge that what he wanted to do was impossible. In fact, it wouldn't even become possible for another 10 years, according to the senior engineers at IBM. Unfortunately, despite months of arguing back and forth and me, my arrogant 17-year-old self, telling my father that this was not possible, he said, well, of course it is, and he fired me for insubordination of all things. And so I knew at this moment that working with my father was probably not going to turn out well. And so I went off to Indiana University under the assumption that I was going to start my own business someday. I knew that I wanted to be a tech entrepreneur and to be a CEO. And on my 19th birthday, not far from this room actually, I read a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The author recommended write your personal mission statement, which I did. And as an overachiever, I wrote 2 of them. The first one was to build one $1 billion company in my life, and the second one was less of a mission statement and more of just kind of a guiding principle for my life, which was to live my life as if somebody would write a book about it someday. Not that I really cared that anyone would write a book about me, but it was really a great way to think about, in very practical ways when I was young and in major decisions in life. I would say, well, if someone was writing a book about my life, what would I want today's story to be about? And so in major life decisions, this was really how I would guide and try to keep myself kind of in a way that I. So I went off. I was worked for a major consulting firm called Booz Allen and Hamilton, and after about 3 years, I got a call from an owner of a software company who was in his 50s, and he said, "Hey, Krister, you can come join me. In 10 years, I'm going to retire, and I'm going to make you an owner, and you'll be able to take everything." I was like, well, this is a great opportunity. This may be the company that I could take to be a billion-dollar company someday. And so I joined him. Unfortunately, the company was struggling a bit. The owner was not the easiest person to work for, which would be a bit of an understatement. And somehow we managed to make it work. And about 10 years later, his retirement age came and went. I waited a little bit more patiently, and then we essentially moved forward with me taking over as CEO. Another 10 years go by, now it's 20 years, and even though he had moved into an owner role and not the CEO role, it had really come to a point where he was kind of in his mid-70s. I was still feeling that I didn't really have the authority of a CEO, and I went to him and I said, "Hey, I think we need to kind of, maybe make an ownership transition. I'd be open to buying the company. If you just name a price, then if I can't find the money to buy this company, then I shouldn't be the CEO." And after 24 hours, he consulted with his sons, and he came back and he said, "There is no price at which I would sell you my company." And so this vision that had been my defining identity since I was 19 years old was gone. And I resigned. And there was a phrase that popped into my mind frequently during that period. Was a phrase that my father used to say, "With friends like that, who needs enemies?" And the challenge was that the owner was not an enemy. The owner was my father. So my own father, after, in many respects, me helping to build the company from 10 people to hundreds of people, refused to sell the company to me, even though he was in his 70s. And this is where I was at the YMCA. I had no one. And so I started to, as I went through this journey and I started to kind of learn these talk shifts, fortunately, one was the content of what they were, but the second was how do you teach them? And so fortunately, I had the opportunity of learning a couple of foreign languages when I was in my late 20s. And I learned foreign language from a man named Jean-Luc. That's not him. It just looks like a guy who might be named Jean-Luc. Jean-Luc is no longer alive, to my knowledge. But so I had the opportunity to move to France to start our businesses in France, and then 3 years later in Germany, shortly after September 11th. And I had one challenge, that my French was terrible. So we were starting a business in France, and when I would talk to people in French on the street, they would look back at me, talk back to me in English. That's how bad it was. So I thought, well, I just need to practice. And we had one of our first customers in France was the Palais de Festival de Cannes, the Cannes Film Festival. And in the south of France, many of the people, especially in IT, don't speak English. So I said, I'm going to go down there. I'm going to give the 3-day workshop on our software entirely in French, and it'll force me to practice. So I did that, spent 3 days, came back. I thought it was not too bad for somebody whose French was not very good. And I got a call from Zach, our salesperson for the French region, on Monday, and he said, Krister, I've got some bad news. I talked to the people in Cannes, and they said, don't ever send him back here ever again. His French is terrible. And so that was when I looked and I found Jean-Luc. So Jean-Luc, within 2 or 3 weeks, I was in his home in Spa, Belgium, and he said, Krister, what did you say to the people in Cannes? And I told him what I said in French, and he goes, Here, let me tell you what you just said to them. You must do this. You should do that. You need to do this. You spent 3 days talking to a bunch of executives, and this is what you're saying. Of course, they'd never want to speak to you again. And that was the first talk shift that he showed me. His specialty is teaching people business French in record time, and the way he does that is by having very simple, easily memorable phrases. And so he said, Krister, I want you to eliminate the phrases you should and you need to from your vocabulary. Just replace them with please. Or I would like you to do this. So you should do this or you need to do this just becomes please do this. I suggest you do this. And so while this seems like a simple thing, I would suggest to you that if you even go through the rest of the day, that you'll probably hear you should or you need to. Either you'll say it or you'll hear others say it 5 or 10 times just in the rest of the day. And that's one of the power of the talk shifts, is just bringing awareness to some of these destructive phrases that we all use unconsciously so that we can start to shift them. Now, you should, you need to. It was actually on the journey, I found that this phrase was actually much deeper, having a much deeper effect on me personally. I was in a dojo, and I'm not a martial arts person. It was actually a leadership, one of these touchy-feely leadership exercises. It was in a dojo, and the exercise was called the grab. So the HR people don't like this, but we get paired up. I was paired with a woman who I think actually happened to be in HR, of all things. And so the facilitator said, we're going to practice making requests of people. And he must have seen the look on my face, because I'm thinking, I've been managing people since I was 20 years old. I don't need any practice making requests of people. And he looked at me and he said, if you don't need any practice making requests of others, think about a request that you make of yourself. I'm like, oh, that's kind of hokey, but sure, why not? I've already paid for the workshop. So I thought of a request, and it's all kind of staged to go really quickly so you don't have a lot of time to think. And so the exercise works like this. He says, step back, take 2 steps forward, grab the arm of the person who's the partner, and make your request. And so I'm thinking of, okay, how do I ask myself to work out when I'm sitting on the couch? At that time, I was on sabbatical, working through all of the drama of not having an emergency contact. And so I step back. You should go work out. You're undisciplined and lazy. And I step back. What'd you think? She said, not only did I not want to do it, I wanted to do the opposite. I was like, I'm going to sit on the couch for the rest of the day, which is, for the most part, what I did when I would ask myself that way, right? And so what I realized was the words we speak to others are often just an echo of the words we speak to ourselves. But then I thought, well, where does this undisciplined and lazy come from? I mean, I had been working 60 to 100-hour weeks for 20 years, and here I am in my 40s saying I'm undisciplined and lazy. And I realized that those are the words that my father said to me when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, and I didn't want to go and get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, learn RPG in the summers. And so as we think as leaders and as parents, what are the words that we use with the people around us that will echo in their minds for decades to come? And that is one of the real power of the talk shifts. The next experience that happened before the journey was I was still CEO. I met a man by the name of Dr. Gerard Bell. He's the founder of the Bell Leadership Institute at, I believe, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And what he does is he studies leadership using what's called a 360 survey. Many of you have probably heard of these. You send out an electronic survey to people around you, and they rate you on a bunch of dimensions, and then it comes back and it gives you a score. And so I got my scores. I'm sitting in a conference room with about 100 other senior leaders. I mean, his workshop costs like $5,000, so it was not an insignificant investment. And I'm sitting in the back. I was actually a little bit skeptical, and I'm looking at my scores, 199 out of 200. I'm thinking, who's the good leader now? I mean, I thought I was going to do pretty well, but 199. And then Dr. Bell says, if your score is close to 200, that's not a good thing. So I pinned the scales, and when I turned to the open-ended feedback of what people had said about me, some of my strengths were, he's young. Which I was like, well, one of my greatest strengths I'm going to outgrow. And so, needless to say, this is the day that I discovered that I was a very difficult boss. And Dr. Bell said, based on, he was in his 80s, he had tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of data points about leaders in the eyes of the people around them. And he said, here's what I can tell you based on the research. If your data's up here around 199 or 200 or over 150 or whatever the number was, I can tell you that you were raised in an environment where one or both of your parents were hypercritical. Nothing was ever good enough. And I can tell you that based upon what your employees are saying about your leadership style. And he said, you might want to change that. Because what it also tells us is that if you don't change it, you're going to pass that on to your children. Somehow, this point completely missed me because this was 5 years before that day I found myself at the YMCA. Because I compartmentalized, I said, oh, this is the way I am at work, and I'm not that way at home. And I wasn't. And the research shows that most of us aren't. In fact, for the most part, none of us are. We may use different words at home that we use at work, but the underlying motivations and some of the subtle cues that we send off tend to be the same. So what I found is, at least in my business career, while I was CEO and in business, the most important exercise that I did was doing this 360. And so many of you, thank you very much, took this Talk Shifts assessment, and I used it to customize some of the content that we're going through. I recognize that not everyone has $5,000 to go to Dr. Bell's workshop, and a lot of 360s, there are some disadvantages that I'll talk about in a moment. So I created this Talk Shifts assessment for people to start to step into this, discovering their blind spots. And I'm not trying to sell you something. It's free and it's easy. That's the first thing. Like mini 360s, they cost a couple $100, and you have to get your HR department involved to get it set up. So this Talk Shifts assessment is free, it's easy. But the second thing that brought me to the biggest realization was that most 360s, when done in a corporate environment, are just your work colleagues. This one was both family and people from work. And there were two reasons for that. One, it gives a little bit more people, so you get more data points to see whether there is agreement between our business and personal lives. But the second thing that comes out of that, for me, was if I'm probably more likely to want to change something if I see that my behavior is showing up in my personal life as well as in my professional life. And the reality is, when I saw my results and I heard this, I did want to change much more than I would have. The challenge was I didn't have the tools to do it, and that's what the Talk Shifts are for. The next thing was when you try to have 10 or 20 people, which if you include people from your personal life, it's easier to get more people. The reason for that is you get, there's safety in numbers. More likely, people are going to give you more critical and honest feedback if they know that there's 10 or 20 data points. If I send it, if a boss sends it to one person who reports to them, probably not going to get the most honest feedback if I know that I'm the only person who's responding. And because you're including family, family tends to be often a bit more honest with us as well. And then the last thing, which is different from a 360, is if I'm a leader and I do have blind spots, and I send out a survey to the people at work, and everyone knows that the HR department is going to see this, and the results are going to go into my HR file, people are a little bit less likely to be honest with me if they have really pointed feedback. So I created the Talk Shift assessment that you can quickly do that, and you can send it out to other people to get feedback. You get little graphs and things like that. But the important point was that you can use the Talk Shifts assessment to build better bosses and become one. And what I mean here is one of the challenges is that how do you reach someone who is an unconscious boss? Someone like me who thought he was a great leader for many years, but actually wasn't. Well, I created the Talk Shift assessment as a way for you to step into a relationship with someone and start that conversation. So here's how it works. I'm the frustrated person in the business relationship. Maybe my boss has got some frustrating behaviors. I take the Talk Shift assessment, and I get 360 feedback from, ding, 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 my boss. And my boss gives me 360 feedback on what are these behaviors. And what I found is that in most cases, when people are responding to the survey about others, they also start to think about their own behavior. So the intention for this Talk Shift tool is to give people who may be in a relationship with someone a tool that they can use to shift the communication from the bottom up. Or if you use it in a personal setting, you can use it to shift personal relationships like I did with my father. One of the things that came out of Dr. Bell's assessment for me was that I led with expertise. And a lot of us are, well, we're all in IT. I find in engineering positions, leading with expertise that's what we're paid to do, right? You have the knowledge about this technology, you're the expert. And what I found is that leading with expertise works until it doesn't. So in a leadership context, what I found is leading with expertise works great if I'm leading a team of 3 or maybe 10 people. But if I want to get to leading 30 people or 100 people or more, there's no way that I can have all of the answers for 100 people or more. I have to start shifting my leadership style from leading with answers to leading with questions. And so what's a simple way that we do that is before you give answers, simply ask, what solutions have you considered? This was one of my greatest frustrations with my own father when he was my boss, is that he would always offer his solutions, like, here's what we need to do with this new version of the product, when he fired me at age 17. And he would never really listen to, well, yes, if he had said, what solutions have you considered? He would have found that all of the solutions he was proposing, well, the first thing I considered was A, and we're not going to do that because this won't work, and this won't work, and this won't work, and then I considered B. So what I ended up doing is listening to all these solutions that I had already gone through and weren't working. And so what it felt is, first, does he not know that I'm smart enough that I could have figured those things out? He has had 30 seconds to think about this problem, and he's already got the solutions. I've been thinking about it for 40 hours, by simply shifting the conversation to what solutions have you considered. It also helps us as leaders to start to develop confidence in the people around us. Because as we start to hear what solutions they've considered, we start realizing that those are the same solutions we were going to give them. Maybe they know what they're talking about. So this leadership shift from solutions to consider, and shifting from what I say, questions lead and answers follow. If you're not leading with questions, then you're following with answers. And these things also work at home. So here's an example of what leading with expertise looks like when we lead with expertise at home.
It's just, there's all this pressure, And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me. And I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. All of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way.
The next talk shift that I learned was around questions, and so I found that I was not a very good listener. And what I realized is that if I upgrade my questions, what if the secret to listening was actually talking? If I ask better questions, then maybe I'm more likely to want to hear the answers. If we start asking questions that we're dying to know the answer to, then we'll be more likely to listen to the answers. And so one of the men who, his name was David Rock, he's a director of the Neuro Leadership Institute, he helped me with one of those kind of just general question tips, which was about asking questions on a scale of 1 to 10. And so there's something that happens in the neuroscience behind this is often, especially sensitive questions. I'm going to take a trivial example, but if I was a boss and I asked you, hey, how do you think we have a good communication here at work? And if I'm the employee, like, are there any other answers other than yes to that question? Yes, yes, and yes. So when I ask a yes-no question like that, and of course no one's asking that question, but I'm using an exaggerated example to illustrate a point. Now, if I shift that question and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with our communication? The neuroscience tells us what happens is most people naturally say, well, it's not a 10 because of this. It's not a 9 because of that. It's not an 8. It's not a 7. It's a 6, but he's my boss, so I can't tell him 6, so I'll tell him 7. The important point is in the follow-up question to say, well, what does a 9 look like? What can we start doing or stop doing to be the difference between a 7 and a 9? And when we structure our questions this way, it does two things. It allows us to, it gives people a little bit more safety to be more honest with us. Because a 6 is a softer yes than a 9, right? So a 6 would probably, well, as we said, in this case, everyone's going to say yes no matter what. But if someone says 6 or even 7, now I can recognize that, oh, this might be something I need to learn a little bit more from than if somebody says 9. But then the second part is that this second part of the question is, people generally have it there kind of on the tip of their tongue. They're more likely to know what the difference is between a 6 and a 9 so that we can have a real conversation about that. Now, if you don't have trust established, they may not be willing to tell you what those things are, but at least they have them on the tip of their mind. And so asking these questions on a scale of 1 to 10 is one way to have more honest conversations with people. And one way to do it is to, especially if it's a very sensitive question, to exaggerate the scale. I mean, I could say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good of a boss do you think I am? 10 being, I am the best leader in the entire world. And 1, I am the absolute worst leader in the entire world. Well, that's a pretty big range. I mean, even a 7 might actually be a good score on that range. So by using these exaggerated scales, we can have allow as leaders, or anyone who's in an uncomfortable conversation, allow them to be more honest by how we ask the question. So emotional intelligence was something that didn't come naturally to me as an engineer. And Daryl probably would not be your go-to guy to learn emotional intelligence from. Because Daryl had just finished a 20-year sentence in maximum security prison for murder, which probably tells you a little bit about my level of emotional intelligence if I learned something from Daryl about emotional intelligence. And anger was a huge part of Daryl's life. He was in a gang, he murdered someone in his teens, and in his late 30s, he got out of prison. And he said he spent a large part of his time in the hole, which is, prison speak for solitary confinement. And he said, one of the things that got me out of the hole was the realization that anger is not a primary emotion. Many psychologists say anger is not a primary emotion. So what we do is when we feel anger, the first step is to ask ourselves what's the emotion behind that anger before we respond. And that's the 6th talk shift. When I feel anger, I say, what emotions are behind my anger? Fear, hurt, guilt, or embarrassment? And this is purposely intended to be a closed-ended question. As I said, emotional intelligence was not a strength of mine. And when people would say, well, what emotion are you experiencing right now? I wouldn't know. I say, I honestly don't know. So by asking ourselves this question and saying, well, you only have 4 choices, fear, hurt, guilt, or embarrassment, pick the one that's closest. Because emotions come in families. And what happens is, like families are like branches on a tree. Fear has different types of fear. There's anxiety, which is a softer version of fear, and then there's terror, which is a very strong version of fear. But simply by saying, well, which of these comes closest? Well, I'm feeling fear probably feels closest, or hurt or embarrassment. This allows me to have a different kind of conversation with someone. If I talk to someone, and let's say it's at work, if a boss comes to us and says, hey, I'm really angry with what happened with that project, what's our immediate reaction? I'm afraid. And the neuroscience fear tells us that when someone's afraid, the part of their brain that's responsible for creative thought and problem solving starts to shut down. So if I'm a boss and I say, hey, I'm really angry about what happened, or I'm disappointed or frustrated, which are just in the anger family. I'm disappointed, I'm frustrated with what your results were on that project. I feel fear on the other side, and I, as a leader, am putting the person exactly in a mental frame of mind that it's more difficult for them to solve the problem and do a good job, which is why I'm angry. Now, I can have a different kind of conversation if I say, well, what is the emotion that I have behind my anger? Maybe I, as the leader, maybe I'm afraid. Maybe I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. Maybe I'm afraid that we're not going to, be able to give big raises and I'm going to lose people on the team, or whatever it may be. So, and now I can have a different conversation. Say, hey, that project that's late, I'm afraid. Yeah. And so what happens is anger pushes people away. But when we talk about these deeper emotions of fear, hurt, embarrassment, and guilt, that pulls people in. And now that person who was previously shut down in a state of fear is now assuming they like me as a boss, like, oh, I don't want my boss to be afraid. How can I help them? And they're still in a mental, physiologically in a mental state that their brain is switched on to be able to help solve that problem. So shifting from talking about anger at work to the deeper emotions behind our anger. Now, when we talk about emotions, there's an interesting thing that happens in English that talking about emotions is we have a unique challenge. So if you look up the word to think or to feel in an English thesaurus, what you'll find is one of the synonyms for to feel is think. Now, if you look up in a German thesaurus or a French thesaurus, if you look up in a French thesaurus, the word is sentir, to feel. You will not find the word penser, to think. That's because these are not synonyms in these other languages. Thinking and feeling are truly separate words. Yet, I can say in English, I feel that you did that on purpose. I feel like I was hit by a bus. And these are not feelings, they're thoughts. So when you notice these words, and again, these are these things that you'll hear all the time. I feel that, that's a trigger. It's not a feeling, it's a thought. And replace those with I feel, and the next word is emotion word. I feel sad, I feel hurt, I feel angry if you choose to go there, I feel guilty, whatever it means. Or if in some corporate cultures using the word feeling is not really looked upon well, you can just say I am sad, I am hurt, I am embarrassed. So these are just alternatives that, depending on what your team culture is, you can use. The next insight for me, and possibly one of the most profound ones into emotional intelligence, came from a book called Nonviolent Communication. It was actually a book that Daryl told me about. He credits this book with actually getting him out of the hole. And it's a great book if you don't want to talk to someone on an airplane. You just kind of hold it up. What are you reading? Nonviolent Communication. Like, all right, see you in LA. That'd be good. So Marshall Rosenberg is no longer alive, but he was it was a bit of a strange character. He used to do his corporate talks with sock puppets and play songs. So this is the kind of person that if I had seen anything by Marshall Rosenberg when I was a CEO, I would be like running the other direction because it was very woo-woo and out there. But interestingly, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, this book, Nonviolent Communication, was the first book that he recommended that all of his senior executives read upon being named CEO of Microsoft. Some people credit it with one of the key kind of philosophies behind changing the culture at Microsoft from a cutthroat culture to more of a compassionate culture. And interestingly, nonviolent communication has never been on any bestseller list anywhere. It's kind of been around in various forms since the 1970s. Of all the books that I've read in business and whatever, this is possibly, it would be in my top five list of all. And what I found was most powerful about it was it was like the language of empathy. Much like these talk shifts are just concrete. Here's how to say it. As somebody who was an engineer and not naturally inclined to be emotionally intelligent, this book gave me the language of emotional intelligence. So one of the things that Marshall Rosenberg talks about is that if someone says, I feel like I've been hit by a bus, we can respond with, I wonder if you're feeling tired. And he calls these empathy guesses. Now, for someone like myself who's not very empathetic to begin with, and I imagine that last time I checked, many of us in IT are not known for our exceptional emotional intelligence skills, so I may not be alone in this room. This concept of an empathy guess, the way we can improve our empathy and our emotional intelligence is essentially through a process of trial and error. So I wonder if you're feeling tired. If what happens is people correct us. No, I'm not really feeling tired. I'm feeling stressed. And so over time, as we continue to make these empathy guesses, we start to get more attuned with people in our lives. And we start to actually just develop, because people tend to be built roughly the same way when it comes to emotions, we tend to develop a deeper empathy and emotional intelligence for all people. And of course, especially the people that we deal with on an ongoing basis. The next insight that was extremely powerful for me was Marshall Rosenberg said, listen for people's needs, not their words. And here I was like, wow, I'm not even good at listening yet, and now I got to listen for people's needs, and but this was really powerful. You imagine you have those people that you're in meetings, and they talk all the time, and you're like, I wish they would stop talking about why do they always have to have all of the things. So rather than listen for their words, what if we listen for their needs? What is it they're needing by talking all the time? Do they need appreciation? Do they need to be recognized? Do they need to feel like an expert? As a leader, when I had that 100 emails coming into my inbox, because I was the guy who was leading with answers and expertise, I started to think so what need am I filling in myself by being the person who has all the answers? I'm filling my own need for appreciation, my own need to feel like an expert. Sometimes the other thing that I learned at the Dr. Bell leadership is that I was hypercritical, and I was always telling people what they did wrong rather than what they did right. And I said, well, what need am I filling? If I'm telling people everything that they need to do wrong, part of that is I'm trying to make myself feel bigger, and by making the other person feel small. And so why would I need to make myself feel bigger? Because I feel small. So sometimes those people who are criticizing us, like as I realized that my father was, it's not because they do feel big, it's because deep down they actually feel small. And criticizing others is one way for us to get to the other side of that, not the most productive way. What really helped me is as I started listening for people's needs, not their words, I had one less need myself. I no longer needed an emergency contact. This talk shifts assessment, the first time after I created it, I didn't actually do this with employees, people that I worked with. I did it with my 7-year-old son. His name is Xander. And so we sat there, and you'd be amazed what you can learn about your leadership from a 7-year-old boy. And it kind of looked a little something like this. We were just laying in his bed. It was on Father's Day, of all things. Well, I do this with him and my daughter as well, every Father's Day. My daughter never wants to play along. My son, he plays along. We sit there, and we have the questions. And I say, hey, here's the first question. I tend to speak more than I listen. And strongly agree. You can do it on a scale of 1 to 10 if you prefer. But you already know what's the follow-up question. So what's the difference between a disagree and agree? Or what's the difference between agree and strongly agree for you? And what can I do to be a better dad? And so having these conversations and taking notes each year, here's what we did last year. Using this talk shift assessment with someone close to you can be a great learning experience. And you know what? You can imagine that the change in behavior, if I send out a survey to a bunch of people that I work with, the likelihood that I'm going to change my behavior is, I don't know, depends on what your results are, But what do you think the likelihood that you're going to change your behavior is if you sit with your son or your spouse or your parent, somebody who maybe is that person that you were frustrated with that you identified at the beginning of the talk, and you have this conversation. And maybe this survey can be a tool to unlock a different level in your relationships, both at work and at home. I did this talk shifts with my father. My father's in his late 70s now, and he doesn't read very well because his eyes are things. So when I had the draft of my book, Talk Shifts, I read it to him aloud. And many of the stories I tell you here are in that, so it was not a comfortable conversation to read this book. And there are many stories that are actually much deeper, but I read him the book. It was kind of like, have you ever read that book, Tuesdays with Maury? It was like, my father's not named Maury, and it wasn't on Tuesdays, but it was just reading him the book over the course of 3 or 4 weeks. 3 or 4 hours each. And after we finished the book, for the first time in his entire life, he said, I never really realized how the impact that my words had on you and on others. And I would submit to you that you probably don't want to find that out when you're 77 years old. So taking the Talk Shift assessment and stepping in to uncovering our blind spots before we have to go back and replay 50 or 60 years of our lives of what we could have done differently. So some of these things are kind of scary. Maybe sitting down with somebody in your life and saying, hey, do I speak more than I listen? Strongly agree. That's really scary for a lot of us. And I find that people fall in two camps when they get exposed to the talk shifts. There are people who say, I'm really excited to do that at people at work, but I'm a little bit afraid of doing that with people in my personal life. And then the next person comes up with a comment and they say, I'm really comfortable doing that in my personal life, but I'm really uncomfortable doing that at work. And if you just take these talk shifts and you practice them in only one part of your life, then that you've missed the point. The real power is when you try to do both. And as you're thinking about when people come up to me, I say, well, imagine, so people say, I don't feel safe talking with my spouse about this, or I don't feel safe talking to my parent, or I don't feel safe talking to my boss about these things. And I say, well, imagine if your house was on fire, and the firefighter was just sitting there watching your house burn, and you went up to him and said, why aren't you running into my burning house? And he said, well, the building is not making me feel safe. And how much does a firefighter earn per year? $50,000? It's actually closer to $40,000 to $45,000. Is it fair to assume that if I'm a leader and I make $100,000, can we expect twice the courage from someone who's making $100,000 than we do of a firefighter? If I make $50,000, can I expect the same level of courage from myself? I mean, it's just entering into a deeper conversation with your boss or someone in your life that you have a frustrating relationship, is that scarier than running into a burning building? The antidote to fear is fundamentally courage. I had a coach once who asked me one of those questions that echoed in my mind for years to come, for 3 years. Shortly after that day at the YMCA, he said, Krister, are you inspired by your life? And of course, at that time, my answer was no. And that is the last talk shift. It was the simple secret to inspiring others, is simply to do something inspiring. Now, if you're thinking of what would be inspiring to you, what would you do? For me, it was running an ultra marathon. And the French phrase bon courage is the kind of phrase that you would say to someone who's running an ultra marathon, about to do an ultra marathon. If you look it up in Google, it'll say good luck. But it's one of those phrases that's lost in translation. You could say good luck to somebody who's going to the casino, but you would never say bon courage to someone who's going to the casino. Because bon courage means good luck in the context when the difference between our success or failure is primarily due to strength. You'll hear the phrase bon courage on the mountaintops of the Tour de France when cyclists are climbing 12,000-foot mountains. The French people scream from the sidelines, bon courage, bon courage. Because when there's a challenge, an obstacle, an ordeal on your path to success, the phrase bon courage applies. I met Miles 1 mile before the end of my first ultramarathon, which is, incidentally, the last time you want more miles. And I told him, Miles, it was also his first ultramarathon. And I want to be clear, I did not run an ultramarathon, I completed an ultramarathon. So there's a very big difference. I have a friend of mine who runs them, and tells me very important that I need to tell people I completed one. I did not run one. But we were swapping stories, and Miles, I had never run more than 3 miles in my entire life. And Miles asked me, he said, what would you have said if I saw you 2 months ago and said, you're going to finish an ultramarathon 2 months from today? And I said, Miles, I would say that that's the version of me that I'd be dying to meet. And Miles said, you know what? You know what happens when you become the version of you that you've been dying to meet? Other people in your life will be dying to meet that version of you too. So who's the version of you that you're dying to meet? Who's the version of you that your children, your spouse, your coworkers are dying to meet? The next morning, I woke up to go to the airport, and on the way, the Uber had a little bit of extra time, and I saw a massage place on the way. And I said, just drop me off there. I was in pain, my whole body. And as you sit down, you have to fill out the paperwork and the picture of the body. Where does it hurt? I'm like, back, legs, all. And I flip over the page, and there's the question again. Who's your emergency contact? And I put down my father's name. I use the talk shifts to transform my relationship with my first and worst boss, who also happened to be my father. And I hope that you can use the talk shifts to transform an important relationship in your life. The phrase bon courage rhymes with another French phrase that you probably already know, bon voyage, which seems like a great way to end our time together. Bon voyage and bon courage. Bon courage. We have a little bit of time for questions. I think we're going to take some questions from the audience.
We're going to get a couple seats up here. Perfect. Thank you.
I'll just do my chair pose.
Okay. Thank you, Krister. That was wonderful, and I know that everyone enjoyed hearing the many inspirational observations that you've made over the course of your career and now also in your personal life. We got one very interesting question which came from one of our audience members. You were talking a moment ago about being hypercritical. Those were the words that you used. And the question came in, but what if your job is to correct mistakes? What if you're on the technical side and that's your job?
I think that what I found is the shift around correcting mistakes is first to ask the question, what would you do differently? Or what did you learn from this? And I think that just shifts the conversation. We also find, I used to use that when I was boss all the time, and maybe I've got 3 things that someone needs to do differently. And often what we find when we first ask the question, what did you learn from this, is that the other person already knows a couple of those things. And maybe I need to add a 3rd one, but people are much more likely to change their behavior and shift their behavior if we say, this is what I would do differently, versus when I'm a leader saying, you should do this differently, or you need to do this differently.
All right, so it's about really teasing out from them their ideas first. Okay. We got another question also that said, do you think our culture overvalues hard skills relative to soft skills?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as somebody who, we built a successful business based on my hard leadership. And I wrote an article about Steve Jobs was one of my idols, and Bill Gates was similar, that they were known for being really difficult bosses. And one of the things I felt is one of the greatest kind of crimes in IT was when Steve Jobs' biography came out. It had this stories about him firing people in elevators, and all these young IT leaders in Silicon Valley and around the world like, that's why I'm such a jerk. Steve Jobs was a jerk. But interestingly, Ed Catmull, the person who worked with Steve Jobs the longest, said, that wasn't the Steve Jobs that I knew. That was the Steve Jobs before he got married and before he had kids. But the Steve Jobs who built the Apple, the company, the giant as we know it, was not the Steve Jobs who fired people in elevators. And so I think that these soft skills, you can be successful up to a point. And admittedly, as much as the business and financial success that I had in business, I probably paid for it 10 times over in the losses in my personal relationships. So it's a balance that all of us need to choose. And I would admit that it's probably a balance that I would choose differently today if I had the choice.
Thanks. I'm going to add one of my questions here. Many people say that company loyalty is a thing of the past. I'm wondering what of your techniques will work to increase loyalty in what is a transient gig economy.
Yeah.
It's a very different economy today.
Yeah. Well, I think, so Daniel Pink wrote a book maybe like 10 years ago called Drive. And he said that once a certain our basic financial needs are met, and I think most people who are working in IT generally are at that financial level in the United States. He said once basic financial needs are met, that motivation and loyalty ultimately comes down to purpose, mastery, and autonomy. And one of the things when I was walking around the reception last night and talking to people, I asked some people, why do people stay here in this team? And I heard multiple times it's because of the mission. So, one reason why people would stay is because of the purpose of the organization. And you don't get that in the gig economy, right? Like if I'm an individual contributor, I kind of don't have that sense of purpose other than some financial. The second thing that I think is also for the people in the audience here is really powerful is, mastery. I mean, the tools that you have at your fingertips to develop mastery in your craft, being an employee in an educational institution is far beyond what most startup companies or small companies like I led. I envy the possibility. But the last one, which I think is what both leaders and people can control, is autonomy. And it's one of the talk shifts, but fundamentally the reason I left my role as CEO is because I didn't feel like I had enough autonomy. And most people don't realize that CEOs have bosses too. They're called shareholders or owners or board of directors if it's a publicly traded company. And as an employee, I think the first step is to have a conversation with our leaders on a scale of 1 to 10. How much autonomy do you think I have? And what we find is that, micromanagers or whatever probably haven't thought about that question. But then we can have a conversation about, well, if my boss thinks that he or she is giving me a 9 autonomy and I think it's only a 7, we can have a conversation about what would the difference between autonomy look like. So I find that loyalty comes down to really having, for top performers, assuming the basic financial needs are met, it comes down to those 3 factors. And as I said, autonomy is the one that, if I don't feel like I have enough autonomy, I can have a conversation with someone about it. But also as leaders, we can have an open conversation with people on our team. How much autonomy do you think I'm granting you? And the last thing I'll mention on that is, it came from actually a CEO, between CEOs like publicly traded companies and private equity firms often actually give outlined autonomy to a CEO. You have the ability to hire someone up to this compensation or make investments up to this level. And the interesting thing is I think this tool can be applied at any level in an organization. As a leader, I can say, here's the authority that you have. I'm going to check in with you once a week on projects that are over $1 million or over $100,000, but I'm not going to check in with you on these smaller ones. And by writing those things down just in an email, now we have the basis for saying, okay, I'm gonna expand your autonomy because now we know what your level of autonomy is agreed first.
I wonder if there are big differences in the languages, in the words chosen by men and women. Oftentimes, for instance, you're inclined to hear one kind of language that men might use, sometimes the same language that women, they might use the same words, and the accusation is very different in terms of their emotional, right? And you're actually encouraging showing that emotion. And yet, is it seen as a disadvantage when women do that versus when men do that? Do your talk shifts, do they have, do you have different recommendations based on gender and based on what you see in the workplace?
I think one thing I noticed is I think women probably could serve themselves better by apologizing less, and men could serve themselves better by apologizing more. I think I have a couple of CEOs who are women who, and they're always apologizing for things. And the interesting thing is that there's actually a phrase in German. The word "I'm sorry" or "apologize" is kind of loaded in English. If you the phrase for in German for "I apologize" literally translates is "it causes me suffering." Well, I can imagine there's a big difference between "sorry" or "I'm sorry" and "it causes me suffering," right? So, so the other thing I say is we need to say sorry less and apologize more. I apologize is different from sorry. Mm-hmm. And I think that my sense is that when women are saying sorry, they're saying, I'm sad for you. And it's different from I've done something wrong and I'm working to reconcile the relationship. There's a man, many of you may know the book, it's one of the most best-selling books, relationship books called The 5 Love Languages. So the author, Gary Chapman, wrote a separate book it was at one point called The 5 Apology Languages. And he breaks down apologies to 5 specific recipes. And I often think that when we apologize and we say things, people don't hear them because we don't speak our apology in words that the other person understands. And so those 5 things were, 1, expressing regret. I'm sorry, I didn't want to hurt you. I wouldn't want to do that again. Taking full responsibility for our actions. I am responsible. The fact that you feel that way is not, I am responsible and it was my fault that I actually did that behavior. The next is committing to change. I'm going to do differently in the future, and can I check in with you a month from now or a week from now to see whether in your eyes I'm actually changing my behavior? And the next thing is making amends. What can I do to make it up to you? And the last is requesting forgiveness. Will you forgive me? Recognizing that in really difficult situations, people might not be ready to forgive us right now. So I think that this apology is probably one of the major ones. The other thing I find that gender difference is, I had a woman who, a CEO of an entrepreneur of, she was about a 20 or 30 person business. And her words were that maybe to some degree seeing a man talk about emotions and maybe get emotional. I think first time I cried in front of my employees was in 2007, and I was very afraid when I did it. But I found that actually if there was one thing that my employees forgave me for my being difficult, it was because I did show emotion. And I think they gave me a little bit of a pass to say, you know what? Maybe he's a jerk 9 times out of 10, but I think his heart is in the right place. And what I realized through this whole journey is that while my heart was in the right place, what really was, my words were not. And when I started to shift my words, it started to shift my behavior. And so I hope that the talk shifts will inspire more male leaders to, and not only inspire, but give practical tools to male leaders to share emotions and be more empathetic at work. And on the women, I believe it's more about inspiring them to have the courage to do so. Because the women who come to me say, I don't really feel like I can actually be myself at work because all my role models were male stoic leaders and I need to show no emotion at work. So I sense that sometimes women go the opposite end of the spectrum and they aren't themselves at work.
Great advice for both men and women. We've got one more question here, and I think that's all the time we have time for, but I'm going to combine it with one as well. So the question came in, Krister, if you were to encounter someone like yourself before your YMCA moment, how would you try to reach them? In other words, what strategy would you use first? And I want to combine this. We have a faculty member in the Kelly School, and he ends every class with, if you've learned nothing else, remember this, and then he fills in the blank so that the students walk away with that final message. And I want to take that question along with what I just said. If there's one thing you're going to recommend people do first, that first step, so that they don't have the same moment that you expressed. If they walk away and remember something from this, what is that?
It's the using this talk shifts assessment, ideally with a family member, and using it to start a conversation, whether it's with a spouse or an adult child or a parent. It can be such a powerful exercise to sit down and say, hey, tell me directly, face to face, how can I be better father, husband, spouse, mother? And what happens is that people often kind of reciprocate. And so it's a great way to just enter into a conversation about how we speak to each other.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And
right.
let's join in thanking Krister for. Thank you.
Thank you.